With this chapter, chapter 3 on Thomas Jefferson, we continue the theme of the president is really more of a startup CEO or startup chief marketing officer than really anything else. And what I cover in chapter 3 is all about the Louisiana Purchase. I kind of re-envision it as kind of like an Oregon Trail. Remember Oregon Trail? I played that when I was a kid. I remember at school we had Oregon Trail on a computer, and in order to get it set up, you had to plug a tape recorder, an actual cassette tape had the game on it that you plugged into the computer. It was 45 minutes later, and you got to play this game. I can't tell you how many times that my character died of dysentery along the way. I bet you have kind of some fun along those lines as well if you're of my vintage. But anyway, with Thomas Jefferson, what's really important to understand is when we think about the Louisiana Purchase and we think about the exploration of that territory, who do you think of? Well, it's undaunted courage. It's the Lewis and Clark expedition, of course. They got through the entire Louisiana Purchase. They crossed the Continental Divide and they got all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They made it back, the whole deal. What is really important to understand as we remember the winners, we don't remember necessarily the other three teams that Jefferson sent out. Much like any startup CEO, you might not just take one bet. You're going to put multiple bets on the table to make sure that one of those teams comes back. It was not at all obvious at that time that Lewis and Clark would succeed. They very nearly didn't on many occasions, and the other teams had varying levels of success. Like any good CMO or CEO, that person's not just playing one bet on the table. That person's going to look at multiple. So in addition to Lewis and Clark, we had a team of Dunbar and Hunter. That was another two-person team. Another team, Freeman and Custis. That was another team that was actually kind of supposed to be the key team. Lewis and Clark was a little bit of Thomas Jefferson's favorite, but Freeman and Custis was probably the most kind of the strongest team. And then finally, Zebulon Pike, which is kind of an interesting character in the grand scheme of things. Zebulon Pike you'll notice he was the only one that was not a team. He was basically by himself. He had very little equipment, very little training, but near and dear to my heart, he went up the Mississippi River on his first of two expeditions. He actually went on two. And on his first one, very nearly found the headwaters of the Mississippi River all the way through Minnesota and very nearly to Lake Itasca, but thought the headwaters were the two Red Lakes up in the northern part of the state. One could be forgiven for that. The Red Lakes are huge. Itasca is basically a pond. So he very nearly did that. Parlayed with Chief Wabasha, very near like the Wabasha and Red Wing area along the river today, if you go there, and set up the grounds for Fort Snelling and some of the other areas there. So it's kind of a really interesting story. So the excerpt I want to read from you is about Zebulon Pike and kind of how he and his expedition turned out. So we're going to read from near the end of the chapter where we're going to talk about Zebulon Pike and how it turned out. Pike. I love an underdog story, and Pike certainly fits the bill. Of all the explorers, his team was the smallest, the least skilled, and the most poorly prepared. At most, he led a dozen men. While other expeditions received the best equipment science had to offer, Pike had in his toolkit, no joke, basically a compass and a watch. Despite this, he very nearly found the headwaters of the Mississippi River in modern-day Minnesota. He parlayed with Chief Wabasha. He negotiated an agreement for the land for a future Fort Snelling. He returned all his men safely. Oh, and did we mention he made this trip in the winter? Remember, part of the mission was to catch British fur traders trespassing, and most trapping and trading happened in the winter. That meant traveling up the river at the worst possible time. No, the maps he drew weren't great, but come on, he wasn't yet 30 years old, and he had little training and equipment. On Pike's second expedition, he struck out to the west. Heard of Pikes Peak in Colorado? It's named for him. No, he didn't climb it, But that's only because his men could barely continue in the cold and snow. It was on his way back from this trip that events conspired to seal his fate. He and his small party were captured by Spanish forces. But even this wasn't completely unplanned. Wilkinson told Pike that he wanted him to spy on Spanish fortifications, populations, and armies. Pike dutifully did so, making notes as he was brought south into Mexico and finally back to the New Orleans area. Surprisingly, but not so surprisingly given Wilkinson's scheming, Pike was treated very well by his Spanish captors. When Pike returned, he began to learn about the Aaron Burr Wilkinson conspiracy and the traitorous plans that were just then exploding in the media. Worse, he was implicated in them. Although the young officer was able to disentangle himself, he likely knew little of what was really going on. His career would never be the same. He died honorably in a British sabotage of a powder magazine explosion in the War of 1812. So that's it for the excerpt from this one. So again, this is an exciting chapter full of information that most people have not heard of before. And it's a fun history lesson. It's a fun introduction to 4 different explorer teams in addition to Lewis and Clark. But what I think is the most exciting and the most interesting is that we really learn about Thomas Jefferson's mindset here. That he wasn't just making one bet, he made 4 bets. Because who knew what was going to happen? The wilderness was very largely untamed. You had no idea what was there. And if, much like a modern CEO, when you really don't understand what's out there or what's going to happen, you can't just take one bet. You have to put multiple bets on the table. And that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson did. So again, go get your copy of Marketer in Chief and dig into chapter 3. You're gonna learn some things you probably had no idea of before.